She didn't scream when they threw her off the train, and that's the part that stays with you. A woman falling into the frozen Wyoming night, not fighting, not begging, just letting go, as if she'd already lost everything long before the conductor's hands ever touched her. But the ground never claimed her. A cowboy did. He caught her in the dark like a man rescuing a ghost he didn't expect to live. And when she opened her eyes in his arms, he said just 3 words that would change both their lives. Ride with me. But here's the twist. He didn't just catch a woman in trouble. He caught the one person powerful men were willing to destroy to keep their sins buried. And saving her might be the one thing that finally forces him to face the darkness he's been running from. Stay with me, because this story begins with a fall, but it doesn't end there. The wind was sharp enough to cut breath in half. It rushed across the Wyoming plains like a restless spirit, dragging the cold with it. Out there, under a moon smudged by winter clouds, the 310 westbound roared across the darkness, steel wheels screaming against tracks that had seen too many stories end in the dust. Nora Carter clung to the metal steps between 2 cars, her fingers stiff with cold, her dress snapping in the wind like a torn flag, her hair slapped across her face, and every jolt of the train shook her bones. She had been holding on for almost an hour, waiting for the right moment, praying for mercy from a world that had given her none. She had no ticket, no bag, no protection. Her carpet bag had been stolen back in Denver by a young man with a sweet face and an easy smile. She trusted him for a moment. And that was all it took. The railroad men didn't care about reasons. Rules are rules, they'd said, voices hard as the ice on the coupler rods. The door behind her burst open, lantern light spilled out, and with it came the conductor's thick silhouette and 2 brakemen. They grabbed her arms before she could even turn. Off. The conductor barked over the roar of the train. "You ain't riding free, missy." "I'm not, please." "I had a ticket. It was stolen." Nora's voice shredded against the wind. "Tell it to the law in the next county." One of the brakemen snarled, tightening his grip. They didn't want her story. They didn't want her fear. All they wanted was to clear the problem. One of them reached into her pocket and yanked out the only thing she had left, a folded letter. Edges, worn soft from being read too many times. "Give that back." Nora lunged for it. The brakeman squinted at the ink under the lantern's thin glow. "Silver Run, Nevada." Her sister's handwriting. A promise of work. A spare bed. A place to start over. He tossed it aside like trash. "Ain't worth nothin' to us." Nora felt something inside her tear in 2. The men dragged her to the edge of the steps. Below was only darkness, sagebrush, and the hard, unforgiving earth rushing by. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't." But Mercy wasn't riding this train tonight. "Rules are rules," the conductor repeated. And then, with a shove that felt almost casual, they forced her fingers loose. The world yawned open beneath her. For a suspended moment, time slowed. Her feet lifted from the step. The wheels screamed below. Cold air swallowed her breath. And the night rose up to claim her. She fell. Not long, no more than heartbeats, but enough for her to understand that this was how her story would end. A broken body forgotten somewhere between telegraph poles and prairie dust. But instead of the ground, she struck something solid, something warm, something alive, a horse and a man. They collided hard. The horse reared with a panicked cry, hooves slashing at the air. The rider leaned forward, wrapping one arm around Nora's falling body as they tumbled down a low embankment. Snow and dirt exploded around them. Nora rolled once, twice, before landing on her back, breath gone, vision spinning wildly. The train didn't even slow. Its lanterns flickered like distant ghosts, shrinking into the night until they were nothing more than a pale thread against the dark horizon. Silence settled in the kind that hummed through your bones after a brush with death. Nora tried to breathe, but her lungs seized. Her coat was torn open, her knees bleeding through ripped fabric. Her hands trembled violently as she pushed herself up on her elbows. A shadow rose from where the tumble had thrown him. He dusted snow from his coat sleeve, then tilted his hat back just enough for the moonlight to catch his face. A man in his early 40s, lean from years of work, quiet in the way a man becomes quiet only after seeing too much. His jaw was rough with a few days' stubble, and a pale scar cut across his cheek like a thin, forgotten road. His horse a bay, gelding shivered nearby, reins trailing, sides heaving from the sudden shock. The man glanced at the fading line of the train, then back at Nora. His eyes were steady, dark, and calm, like he'd seen storms far worse than this one. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, voice low, shaped by dust and long roads. Nora swallowed hard. I don't know." He crouched beside her, checking her legs with careful hands. "Nothing seems broke. Hurts like hell. I bet." She nodded, trying to keep her breath steady. The cold cut deeper now that the train's roar had vanished, leaving her small and shaking in the vast night. The man stood, offered his hand. "Name's Elias Rourke." She stared at his hand, then at the desolate plains around them. No sound except the wind, no light except the thin moon. No one else was out here. No one coming. Elias looked at her with quiet certainty, as though the world wasn't falling apart around them. "Seems the railroad's done with you, ma'am," he said. Tipping his hat in a gesture both gentle and sure, he nodded toward his horse, standing steady now in the half-light. "Ride with me." For the first time since Denver, Nora felt the faint, trembling shape of a choice, and the cold prairie waited for her answer. The cold had a way of creeping into a person's bones after a fall like that. Nora tried to stand, but the world tilted. Her legs wobbled beneath her as though they no longer belonged to her. Elias stepped closer slowly, like approaching a skittish horse, and knelt beside her. "Mind if I look?" he asked, voice level. Nora didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice. She simply nodded, keeping her eyes on the dark horizon instead of his face. His hands moved along her shins and ankles with practiced ease. They were warm, steady, and strangely gentle for a man who looked carved from the same stone as the plains. No prodding, harder than needed. No lingering longer than necessary. When he pressed on her right ankle, she winced. "Not broken," he said. "Sprain, maybe. You took one hell of a jump." "I didn't jump," she whispered. "I know." There was no judgment in his tone. No pity either. Just acknowledgement. A small thing. But in the cold night, it felt heavier. When she tried again to stand, her knees buckled. Elias reached out, caught her elbow, steadied her without a word. He rose and walked to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with a wide saddle darkened by years of sun and sweat. With one tug, he loosened a blanket roll, shook it out, and laid it across the saddle's front. "One horse, one saddle," he said. "You'll ride up front. I'll guide." Nora stiffened. "I can walk. Not 10 miles you can't." "I'd rather try." He didn't argue. He just stepped back, letting the night answer for him. The prairie stretched in every direction, flat, blue-black, and endless. The wind carried the smell of sage and some distant storm. A wolf howled somewhere far to the west, its thin cry trailing into nothing. The rails glinted faintly under the moonlight like twin silver scars. Nearest place is Red Hollow, Elias went on. Small rail town, warm beds, coffee that'll burn a hole clean through you. A faint smile ghosted across his mouth. 10, maybe 11 miles. Can get you there 'fore dawn if we move steady. Nora clenched her jaw. She didn't want to be helpless in front of a stranger. Didn't want to need anyone's mercy. Not after everything. She gathered what was left of her dignity, straightened her torn coat, and began walking. The first few steps were stubborn, measured. She pulled her shoulders back, head high, though her breath stuttered with pain. Elias watched her a moment, then murmured something to the horse, patting its neck. He didn't follow immediately. Nora made it maybe 200 feet. Her ankle twisted sharply. She stumbled, sucked in a ragged breath, and dropped to one knee in the dust. Tears threatened, burning hot against the cold air. She pressed her lips together to keep them from spilling. She would not cry. Not here. Not with him watching. But the night didn't care about her pride. A gust of wind cut through her coat, and she shivered hard enough that her teeth clicked. Elias approached without hurry. He stopped a few feet away, boots planted firm in the dirt. He didn't crouch beside her this time, didn't reach for her. He just offered his hand the same steady way he had earlier. Dust is colder than a saddle. Miss, he said, voice low but carrying in the cold, ride with me, or you'll freeze before sunup. She kept her gaze on the dirt, blinking fast. The tears stayed there unshed, but close. Finally, she exhaled a tremor of surrender and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, solid. Her first small trust. He lifted her easily, guiding her toward the bay gelding. With his help, she mounted the saddle. The leather creaked softly beneath her weight. Elias swung up behind her, the horse shifting to balance. She felt the heat of his coat at her back, the faint smell of pine smoke and old sweat. He reached past her, taking the reins in both hands. Lean back a little, he said. You'll keep warmer that way. She did, but reluctantly. They started at a slow walk, hooves crunching frozen earth. The night wind stung her cheeks, though Elias kept the horse angled to block the worst of it. He didn't talk. She didn't either. Their silence was not uncomfortable, just full of things neither dared say. She stole brief glances at him when the moonlight allowed. His hat was worn. Brim frayed from weather. A pale scar traced the line of his jaw, a thin, deliberate mark, like something made by a knife rather than time. And holstered at his hip was a revolver, polished smooth by years of use, the handle darkened by sweat. This was a man who had seen bad roads and somehow survived them. They rode past a toppled telegraph pole. Its wires hummed in the wind, vibrating like faint, broken music. The sound made Nora shiver. It reminded her too much of that moment on the train, the metal groaning, the world falling out from under her. She clutched the folded letter in her coat, the only thing she had left. Elias noticed the movement. Someone waiting for you. She hesitated. My sister. In Silver Run. He nodded once. Good to have someone waiting. Nora unfolded the letter just enough to feel its creases. Part of the text caught the moonlight. Come to Silver Run. We'll start fresh. The past can't follow you this far west, but the past had longer legs than she thought, and maybe sharper teeth. She didn't finish the thought. Instead, she closed her eyes and held the letter tight, as if it could keep her warm. The horse's steady gait and Elias's quiet presence did the rest. Somewhere ahead, Red Hollow waited. Behind them, the train carried her old life away like drifting smoke. But tonight, just for tonight, she wasn't falling anymore. She was being carried, and that truth frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. The sky was only beginning to shrug off the night when they reached the outskirts of Red Hollow. Dawn hadn't decided if it wanted to rise or sink back down, and the whole world felt caught between breaths. A thin gray light washed over the plains, softening the jagged lines of the cold, hard earth. Elias slowed the bay gelding to a gentle walk. Nora, stiff and aching from the ride, blinked against the wind as shapes slowly emerged out of the early morning haze. A narrow main street, wooden storefronts leaning like tired old men. A blacksmith's forge, with smoke curling from its chimney, Hank Crowley, already at work, hammer clanging like a heartbeat. A general store with dusty windows. A small chapel whose bell rope hung frayed and broken, swaying weakly in the breeze. And at the end of the street, the saloon, the Copper Spur, its swinging doors creaking in the morning chill. It wasn't much of a town, but it was more than Nora had expected after a night of falling and riding through the dark. As they entered Red Hollow, heads turned slowly, deliberately. Folks stepped out onto porches or peeked from windows. A woman on a man's horse. Clothes torn, hair tangled by the wind, face pale from cold. That kind of sight stirred talk faster than wind stirred dust. Nora felt their eyes like pins on her skin, judgment in every glance, speculation in every whisper, fear in a few of them. Two like Trouble had just ridden into town on the same horse she did. Elias sat straighter in the saddle. "Ignore it," he murmured. "Red Hollow hasn't had excitement since last spring's flood. You're just something new to look at." But the words didn't soften the glances. Not really. A man stepped out from between the general store and the saloon, broad-shouldered, gray hair at his temples, badge pinned over his vest. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been through enough battles to know which ones mattered. "Marshal Jed Lawson," Elias said under his breath. "Used to be cavalry out at Fort Kincaid. Good man. Mostly." The marshal stopped a few feet from the horse. His gaze went to Nora, first sharp, assessing, then shifted to Elias. "Morning, Rourke," he said. "You bringin' trouble into my town. Not unless she counts as trouble." Elias replied evenly. Lawson crossed his arms. "Care to tell me why a woman's riding double before sunrise? Looking like she's been dragged from here to Cheyenne?" Nora tried to speak. The lie came to her lips. Automatically habit of survival. I just, but Elias cut in gently. "Trainmen threw her off the 310 westbound last night. No ticket, no mercy." The marshal's jaw tightened. He looked at Nora again. Slower this time. That true. Her throat worked, but no sound came. "She's under my word while she's here," Elias said. Something changed in the air then. Words like that meant something in Red Hollow. A man staking his name wasn't done lightly. Lawson studied him a long moment. Then he sighed. "This town's full of folks barely hanging on. If trouble follows her, make sure it stops at your doorstep, not mine." "Fair enough," Elias said. The marshal stepped aside, letting them pass. The onlookers pretended to go back to their chores, but Nora could still feel their curiosity chasing her down the street. Elias turned toward a white-painted house beside the chapel, a sloping roof, two narrow windows, and a porch that leaned a little to the left. Smoke drifted from its chimney, carrying the smell of coffee and biscuits. Miss Alma's place, Elias said. She runs the only boarding house worth sleeping in. Nora swallowed. Will she take me? She'll try to refuse, he answered honestly. She's cautious, but she's kind. He dismounted first, then helped her down. When Nora's boots touched the ground, pain shot up her ankle, and she nearly buckled. Elias steadied her with one hand on her elbow, the gesture calm and familiar by now. The door opened before they reached it. A woman in her late 40s stepped out, Miss Alma. Her face carried both sternness and compassion, carved in equal measure by years of hardship. She wore a faded apron, and her dark hair was pinned back neatly. Her gaze went straight to Nora's torn dress, her bruised legs, and the frostbite edging her fingertips. No, she said immediately, not taken in train strays. Not again. Nora's heart thudded painfully. She braced herself for rejection, another door shut, another wall built against her. But Elias didn't move. He took off his hat, holding it respectfully against his chest. There was something in the way he stood quiet, steady, waiting that made Alma look again, more carefully this time. Nora's bare, bleeding feet, the thinness of her coat, the exhaustion trembling beneath her skin. And the way Elias watched, not forcing, not pleading, just letting Alma see the truth for herself. The older woman sighed, a long breath that carried the weight of too many hard winters. All right, she said finally. One night? After that, we'll see what the good Lord says. Nora almost collapsed with relief. Elias helped her onto the porch. Alma guided her inside with a firm hand, already muttering about warm water and clean bandages. Before he stepped away, Elias turned back to Nora. He tipped his hat, the faintest hint of a smile touching his eyes. Rest up, he said. I'll check on you 'fore sundown. She didn't know why those simple words hit her so deeply. Maybe it was the steadiness in them. Maybe because it had been a long time since anyone promised to come back for her, and even longer since she believed they actually would. As the door closed behind her, Nora found herself leaning toward the window, watching Elias walk back into the gray dawn until the rising light swallowed him whole. Somehow. The promise lingered in the quiet room, warmer than the fire Alma was building. The smell of frying cornmeal and strong coffee drifted through the boarding house at first light. Nora woke slowly, heavy-limbed and sore from the night before. The narrow room was warm, lit by a single streak of sun sneaking through the curtains. For a moment, she let herself feel safe. But safety, she knew, never stayed long. A soft knock sounded, and Miss Alma pushed the door open with her hip, balancing a tray. Morning. Dear, coffee's hot. Don't let it get cold waste of beans if you do. She set the tray on the bedside table and gave Nora a look that was kind, but sharp enough to peel truth from bone. You rest any a little, Nora murmured. Thank you. For taking me in, Alma waved a hand. Wasn't charity, was decency. World's short on that lately. She poured coffee into a chipped mug. Now drink. Nora obeyed, though her hands trembled as she lifted the cup. The warmth steadied her breath, and Alma watched every flicker of her expression. After a quiet moment, the older woman folded her arms. You got people waiting on you. Nora stared into the dark coffee. A sister. In Silver Run. I was headed there. And before that, Nora hesitated. She'd learned the hard way that honesty could be a dangerous luxury, but something in Alma's gaze, years of grief, years of rebuilding, made deceit feel dishonorable. I was a schoolteacher, Nora said softly, back east. Small town outside St. Louis, Alma nodded. I can see that. You carry yourself like someone used to chalk dust in children's questions. Nora tried to smile, but it faltered. And your husband, Alma, asked, gentler now. Gone. Nora whispered. Factory fire. I was 23. Lord save us, Alma murmured. That kind of loss changes a soul. Nora looked down at her hands. After he died, I moved to Kansas City. The Western Continental Railroad needed clerks. Her voice splintered. I thought it would be a new start. Alma's brow creased, but before Nora could continue, the woman squeezed her arm once and stood. Come to the kitchen when you're steady. I kept some biscuits warm. When Nora made her way downstairs, the kitchen smelled of butter and wood smoke. Alma shuffled toward the pantry to fetch preserves. Muttering about needing to restock, she pushed aside a tin, frowning. Now how'd that get left back here? Nora didn't notice at first. Not until she saw Alma freeze shoulders stiff. Breath caught halfway. Nora, Alma said quietly, come here. Fear crawled up Nora's spine. Alma pulled a folded sheet from the pantry wall, yellowed at the edges, ink smudged by handling. She unfolded it with the solemnity of a funeral prayer. Nora knew what it was before she saw her own face staring back. Wanted Nora Carter embezzlement, railway theft, $200 reward. Her knees almost gave out. Alma's eyes narrowed not with cruelty, but with the confusion of someone whose instincts battled what paper claimed. A traveling drummer, left this here weeks back, said the railroad wanted folks to keep watch. Nora could barely breathe. I didn't steal anything. Alma held the poster up. Then why's your face on this wall? Tears blurred Nora's vision. Her throat felt full of gravel. Because I found numbers that didn't add up. Widows' pensions money for families of men who died on the line. Someone was pocketing it. When I asked questions, they said I was mistaken. Then the books vanished. My desk was searched, and suddenly, her hand fluttered helplessly toward the poster. Alma's fingers were steady, but her face was troubled. That's a powerful accusation. It's the truth, Nora whispered. I swear it. Silence filled the little kitchen thick, heavy, curling like smoke. Alma looked at her a long moment, saw the shaking hands, the hollow exhaustion, the kind of fear that didn't spring up overnight. She folded the poster once, twice, then tucked it under her arm. Anybody worth catching that hard, she said quietly, was either mighty wicked or mighty dangerous to wicked men. Nora pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to stop the sob building in her chest. Alma didn't embrace her. That wasn't her way. But she set a cup of water on the table and spoke in a softer tone. Sit, breathe. You're safe in my house for now. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Nora washed with warm water. Alma changed her bandages. A few curious boarders came and went, whispering in hallways. Nora stayed mostly in her room, staring at the cracked ceiling, feeling the old fear claw its way back up. Late afternoon brought long shadows stretching across the main street. The sound of boots on the porch made Alma glance toward the door. Elias, she murmured. Nora's heart jumped before she cursed herself for it. Elias stepped inside, hat in hand, dust on his coat. He nodded to Alma, then looked toward the stairs, concern flickering across his face. How is she? Alma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she held out the folded wanted poster. The gesture alone seemed to dim the light in the room. Elias took it without blinking. He opened it, read it. His expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, sharpened, the way a man's do when he sees danger he recognizes too well. So, he said quietly, they're still hunting. You know about this, Alma asked. I know the railroad, Elias replied, jaw tightening. And I know what they do when someone pokes where they shouldn't. He folded the poster, slow and deliberate, then slipped it inside his coat, as though accepting a burden he'd carried before. Without another word, he stepped onto the porch. Nora watched from the staircase, unseen. Elias stood there for a long time, staring east, the direction the rails ran, the direction her trouble would come from. The wind tugged at his coat, but he didn't move. Then, with the quiet certainty of a man who'd made up his mind, he lowered his hat and walked into the settling dusk, as though stepping toward a decision that would change both their lives. Nora's breath caught, because for the first time, she realized someone else might fall because of her, and she wasn't sure if her heart could bear that weight again. The morning wind carried the smell of horses and cold iron as Elias waited beside the livery. Frost clung to the fence rails, glittering in the pale sun. Nora approached carefully, still walking with a slight limp, her shawl tight around her shoulders. Miss Alma had sent her on an errand for fresh eggs, but Elias intercepted her before she reached the street. Walk with me, he said quietly. She hesitated, but followed him behind the livery, where the noise of town faded into the thump of hooves and the soft shuffle of straw. Elias leaned against a corral post, arms folded, gaze fixed on the frozen dirt. I need the whole truth, he said. Nora swallowed hard. About the poster, about all of it. There was no accusation in his voice, just a steady demand, like the ground expecting a footstep. She folded her hands, knuckles white. There was a superintendent in Kansas City, she began. Charles Merriweather. Important man, well-liked, the kind whose boots never touched mud. She drew in a shaky breath. He kept 2 sets of books. One official, one private. The private one diverted money that was meant for widows of railroad workers killed on the lines, pennies saved from men who got crushed under cars or burned in boiler explosions. Elias's jaw flexed. Nora went on. I wasn't supposed to see them. I wasn't even supposed to be working that night, but another clerk fell ill, and I stayed late. I found the ledgers in his desk. Her voice softened to a whisper. And the next morning, they were gone. My drawer was ransacked. The company safe reported opened. Somehow the blame landed on me. Nora blinked hard, fighting tears. I tried to defend myself, but every book, every paper pointed my direction, until I ran. Elias pushed off the post and paced a slow line, boots crunching frozen straw. His silence stretched long enough that Nora wondered if she'd lost whatever sliver of trust had formed between them. At last he spoke. Railroad don't leave loose ends, he said, low. Never has. You believe me, she asked. He turned, meeting her eyes with a steady, unreadable look. I've seen enough lies to know when someone ain't tellin' one. Heat pricked behind her eyes, relief mixed with fear. Before she could speak again, he nodded toward the street. Go on back. Alma will fuss if you're gone too long. Nora left, feeling exposed, yet strangely lighter, as if truth spoken aloud finally let her breathe. Elias didn't head home. Instead, he crossed the rutted street toward the Copper Spur, its doors swinging in the breeze, like they were too tired to stay still. Inside, the room smelled of stale whiskey, smoke, and the faint, lingering odor of spilled dreams. A few early drinkers hunched over tables. The barkeep, Ezra Pike, no relation to the railroad detective, though the man's grin always looked like it was hiding something polished glasses behind the counter. Well now, Ezra said smirking. "If it ain't Elias Rourke, thought you'd sworn off morning liquor. Not drinkin'," Elias replied. "Just passing through. Two old-timers sitting near the stove exchanged glances. One chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Heard you brought a lady into town. That right." Rourke Elias ignored them, but they weren't done. "Ain't heard your name tied to a woman since before you quit the Crowder boys," the other man said. "Still remember that raid up in Deadman's Cut? You were wild back then." Ezra leaned forward, enjoying the tension. "Folks say you rode with wolves once?" Elias. That true, Elias's shoulders tightened, though his face stayed calm. "I rode with men who made bad choices, myself included." "Bad choices," one of the old riders snorted. "Crowder gang robbed trains like they were harvestin' wheat. Western Continental lost thousands, and a kid lost his life," Ezra added softly, for once without a grin. "Whole Valley remembers that." A shadow passed over Elias's face. He didn't deny a word. He couldn't. The memory cut too deep. The saloon door swung open. A young cowboy strutted in, barely 20, with a cocky smile and a gun too clean for real use. He glanced around, spotted Elias, and smirked. "Well, I'll be damned." Elias Rourke, the railroad robber turned savior of stray women. The room stiffened, chairs creaked. Someone hissed a warning, but the boy didn't take it. "You ain't no better than the men who tossed that woman off the 3. 10, he said, stepping closer. "Wolves don't change. They just find new woods." Elias slowly turned, his eyes cold enough to freeze whiskey. A long silence filled the bar, the kind that has weight, the kind that decides which souls get to walk out. Then Elias spoke. "That's exactly why," he said, voice low and edged with steel. "I won't stand by and watch it happen again. No threat, no drawn gun. Just a truth spoken with such quiet force that the boy's bravado slipped like water through fingers." He stepped back, muttering, suddenly fascinated with the floorboards. Elias left the saloon without looking back. The afternoon sun was dipping toward the hills, painting long shadows across Red Hollow. He walked toward his small cabin on the edge of town, the weight of old sins pressing on his shoulders like an invisible saddle. Inside, the cabin was sparse: a cot, a wood stove, a shelf with a few battered books, and a rifle polished more from habit than need. Elias sat on the edge of the cot, elbows on knees, staring at the floor. Helping Nora meant riding against Western Continental, the same company whose trains he once stole from, the same power he had tried to outrun for years. And if he stepped into this fight, he'd be stepping into a past that had already taken more from him than he could bear to lose again. The wind pushed against the walls, rattling the window panes. Elias closed his eyes. He knew what choice decent men made. He just wasn't sure, after everything, whether he still counted as one. Sunday morning came soft and pale, as if the sun were feeling its way across the sky rather than rising. Red Hollow moved slower on Sundays. Chores waited, coffee brewed longer, boots scraped the dust with less urgency. St. Brigid's Chapel sat at the edge of town, a small clapboard building leaning slightly west from years of wind. Its bell rope still hung broken, swaying in silence. Inside, the pews were cracked in places, and the stained glass windows had faded until the saints in them looked tired from watching too many hard winters. Nora stepped through the doorway with Alma beside her. A few heads turned, mostly women, some men, and a half-dozen children who blinked at her with curiosity. She sat in the back, hands folded tightly in her lap, trying not to feel the weight of every glance. Reverend Cole cleared his throat as he began the hymn, his voice warm but raspy, worn thin by years of dust and prayer. The congregation sang softly, each voice reaching only as far as it could. No one expected perfection, only effort. Midway through the service, Reverend Cole sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if the thought he carried was too heavy. "Folks," he said quietly, "we still don't have a teacher for the young ones. Been near 6 months now. If we don't find someone, they'll grow up knowing little more than how to swear and chase chickens." A ripple of chuckles moved through the chapel, but it was tinged with worry. Nora watched a little girl in the front row, dark braids, patched dress tracing the edge of a worn Bible with her finger. The girl whispered each letter as if trying to tame it. A smudge of dirt streaked her cheek, and she concentrated so fiercely that Nora felt her throat tighten. She missed this. Classroom mornings, children's questions, the sound of a pencil scratching on slate. She forced her gaze down to the hymn book, but the ache remained. Elias stood near the back, arms folded loosely. He wasn't a churchman by nature, but he came today. And as Nora's attention lingered on the small girl struggling with the words, Elias noticed. Their eyes met for half a heartbeat. He looked away first, thoughtful. After the service, townsfolk drifted toward the door. Alma chatted with Reverend Cole. Children spilled into the yard, chasing each other around a half-rotten stump. Elias joined them outside, tipping his hat politely. "Reverend," he said, "you still looking to find a teacher?" Cole snorted. "I'd take anyone who knows their letters and can keep a classroom in one piece." Elias glanced toward Nora, but only for a second. Might be someone in town who fits the bill? Alma raised a brow. "Don't go voluntelling folks what they ought to do." Elias Rourke. "Just making an observation." Elias replied softly, but Nora felt that quiet suggestion land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. That afternoon, Alma made stew beans, potatoes, a hint of sage. The kitchen smelled warm and lived in. Nora helped slice bread, while Elias sat at the table, polishing his gloves, pretending not to be watching her. When the meal was served, conversation circled the usual Sunday topics, whether Godard or cattle, Hank Crowley's stubborn mule, but eventually, Elias set his spoon down. "Reverend Cole needs a teacher," he said, looking at Nora now, not dodging. "Kids deserve something better than wild guessing and hope." Nora stiffened. I was only passing through," Elias nodded. "I know, but I've seen you look at those children. Couldn't miss it if I tried." Heat rose to her cheeks. "I don't know if it's safe for me to stay." Elias, safe. Alma snorted. "Safe left this town 10 years ago. What we got is decent folk and a chapel that leaks. That's about it." Elias leaned forward, voice gentler. "I'm not asking you to hide here. I'm asking you to live if you want to." Nora's breath caught. "And what would I be? Then a fugitive who teaches the alphabet? No." Elias said, "A teacher who's had a hard run of luck, paid from church tithe and whatever families can spare. Honest work, honest place. It was too much, too kind, too dangerous." She set her spoon down, hands trembling. "I can't promise anything. I just got here." "Then don't promise," Elias said. "Just try." His voice held no pressure, only quiet hope. The same hope she'd felt fluttering in her chest that morning. And that was what frightened her most. After a long moment, Nora whispered, "1 week, I'll help for 1 week. That's all I can say." Alma smiled under her breath. 1 week's enough to change a town. if a person's the right kind. Later that day, as word traveled through Red Hollow that a teacher might finally have arrived, Hank Crowley strode out of his forge, wiping soot from his beard. Heard something about lessons, he grumbled, voice booming like a drum. If that lady's teachin', I'll build desks for free. Don't need my boys growing up dumb as fence posts. Nora blinked at him in surprise. Thank you. Mr. Crowley, truly, don't thank me yet, he said. You ain't seen my boys. His laugh rumbled through the street like distant thunder. People still looked at Nora with caution, still whispered behind hands, but somewhere in their eyes, a spark of something new flickered. Hope, maybe, or hunger for change in a town that hadn't had any in too long. By sundown, Nora stood alone behind the chapel, watching dust settle in golden streaks across the prairie. Her heart felt unsteady, walking a narrow line between fear and belonging. She told herself it was only a week, just 7 days, nothing more. But the truth hung in the quiet air. If she stayed, even briefly, she'd be stepping into a life she wasn't sure she deserved, and stepping away from the one she'd been running from. The chapel bell rope swayed above her, broken yet still moving with the wind. For the first time in a long while, Nora wondered if broken things could still do some good. Winter crept toward Red Hollow, long before the calendar admitted it. The wind sharpened, the air thinned, and the clouds gathered like old debts settling overhead. But inside the little chapel school, the days felt gentler. Nora stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, tapping out simple sums on a battered slate. The children leaned forward, tongues between their teeth, brows furrowed in concentration. When the smallest boy, Eddie Crowley, finally got his addition right, he grinned so wide, his ears turned red. The room burst into applause. It felt normal, tender, almost like a life she could have had all along. Across the yard, Elias knelt beneath the chapel steps, hammering new nails into a board that had threatened to give way for months. He worked quietly, sleeves rolled, breath clouding in the cold air. Nora caught glimpses of him through the windows, the sure hands, the calm movements, the way he always glanced toward the schoolhouse door at the smallest sound. Sometimes she wondered if he was guarding the building, or her. By the end of the week, the first snow drifted down in small, cautious flakes, barely more than whispers. Children ran outside to catch them on their tongues. Boots crunched along the street. Smoke curled from chimneys. Red Hollow, for a brief moment, felt like it was wrapping itself around her. Then the stranger rode in. Nora didn't see him at first. She only heard the shift in the town's noise, the hush that rolled across the street, the careful clearing of throats, the uneasy shuffling of boots. She stepped to the classroom window and saw him dismounting at the hitching rail outside the copper spur. His coat was too clean, his boots too polished. His gun looked like it had never seen dust, only oil, a man out of place. He walked with a cold, stiff confidence, the kind that came from power borrowed rather than earned. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded paper. Then, with a deliberate slap, he tacked it to the post outside the saloon. Nora's heart dropped. From inside the chapel, Elias stood. Hammer paused mid-swing, his jaw clenched hard enough to show the muscle in his cheek. Marshall Lawson approached the stranger. "You looking for someone?" he asked. The man tipped his hat politely, but the gesture held no real respect. "Edgar Pike, Western Continental Railroad Investigation Division." A murmur moved through the onlookers. Pike tapped the poster. "I'm here for a fugitive. Goes by the name Nora Carter." His voice carried across the street like a blade, scraping over stone. Embezzlement, fraud, theft from widows' pensions. He let the accusations drip slowly into the crowd. $500 for her arrest, dead or alive. If she resists. 500, more than double the last notice. Nora's breath vanished. She leaned closer to the window, hands gripping the sill until her knuckles blanched. Elias didn't move, but she saw the fury tighten his shoulders. Inside the saloon doorway, Ezra Pike froze, mid-polish. 500, he muttered under his breath. Girl must have kicked the railroad's favorite dog. The marshal studied the poster. Your description says she's armed. She's dangerous. Edgar Pike replied smoothly. Men have already been hurt. He raised his voice toward the gathered townsfolk. If any of you are harboring her, you'd be doing the railroad and justice a service by speaking up. The crowd shifted uneasily. Prim faces turned hard. Curious faces soured. Some looked toward Alma's boarding house and toward Nora's window. Reverend Cole stepped out of the chapel, wiping his hands on his coat. Mr. Pike, Red Hollow isn't in the habit of turning folks out into the cold without proof. Pike smiled thinly. Proof is exactly what I carry. He pulled another copy of the poster from his bag and held it high, letting the wind unfurl it. The black letters screamed across the quiet street. Nora Carter, embezzler, fugitive, reward $500. Alma, passing by with a basket of turnips, stopped dead. Her eyes found Nora's through the window. They widened with fear and something like heartbreak. Pike stepped forward. Anyone seen her? He asked loudly. Anyone at all. Nora stepped back from the window until the shadows swallowed her. Her fragile new life chalk, dust on her fingers. Children's voices in her ears. Warm bread in Alma's kitchen began to crumble as easily as old plaster. She knew what happened when she stayed too long anywhere. Trouble came, and it never came quietly. That night, long after the lamps were blown out at the boarding house, Nora packed her small bag. She put in only what she needed: the letter from her sister, a clean pair of stockings, and the leftover biscuits Alma tucked into a cloth. She moved slowly, careful not to wake the others, her breath trembling in the cold stairwell. She could walk. She could make it to Silver Run in 3 days if the weather held. Better to disappear quietly than let Red Hollow bear the cost of her misfortune. But when she opened the back door, snow gusted in soft flakes, swirling like ghosts around her boots. A lantern glowed just beyond the porch. Elias stepped out of the shadows. You weren't planning on going far with that ankle, he said quietly. Nora froze. Elias, I can't stay. They'll tear this town apart looking for me. He shook his head once. You leave now. They win twice. They take your name. And your home. Snow gathered on his coat, melting down the seams. His face held no anger, only a deep sadness, and something like resolve. Nora tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. All the fear she had swallowed since Kansas City rose suddenly, choking her. I don't want anyone hurt because of me, she whispered. Then let me stand between you and the hurt, Elias said. The simple, steady words broke something open in her. For the first time since the factory fire, since the railroad office, since the 3:10 westbound threw her to the wolves, she let herself fall into someone's arms, not out of desperation, but out of sheer exhaustion. She sobbed against his coat, her tears soaking into the worn fabric. Elias held her as the snow kept falling soft, relentless, silent, and for a long, fragile moment, The world felt held together only by the strength of one man's quiet promise. Dawn had barely cut a faint line across the horizon when Elias saddled the bay gelding and helped Nora mount. Frost clung to every fence rail in Red Hollow, turning the town white and unreal. No one stirred as they rode out, no curious eyes, no slow goodbyes. Snow muffled their hoofbeats until the whole world seemed to whisper around them. Nora huddled in her coat, breath fogging in front of her. "I shouldn't have let you do this," she said quietly. "Hiding me only puts you in deeper trouble." Elias kept his eyes forward. "There's smart running, and there's stupid running. You were about to do the second kind. I can still go alone." He shook his head. "And freeze by sundown, no. You're staying safe until I figure how far Pike plans to push. Where are we going, High Ground? Old place nobody remembers." They followed a narrow trail skirting the ridge. The wind grew stronger the higher they climbed, as if pushing them back toward Red Hollow. But Elias kept riding, jaw set, coat whipping behind him. After nearly 8 miles, the ruins appeared gray shapes rising out of the frost like bones of a long-dead beast. Fort Kincaid, once a proud cavalry post, now little more than sagging beams and half-collapsed walls. A flagpole leaned at a drunken angle. Rope long vanished. Snow filled the old parade grounds. Barracks yawned open, their windows hollow as empty eyes. "This is safe," Nora whispered. "Safe enough. No one's ridden up here in years." Elias dismounted and helped her down. Storm took out the north side 5 winters back. Most folks think the whole place is ready to fall. Inside the old officers' quarters, dust coated everything in a thin gray film. A cot frame leaned in a corner, springs rusted into useless shapes. A cracked stove stood stubbornly in the center, as though waiting for orders that would never come. Elias set down a small bundle of supplies: bread, jerky, a tin of beans, a blanket rolled tight. You light a small fire, nothing more. Smoke can't be seen from the trail if you keep it low. Nora touched the cold stove, imagining the lives once lived in this room. "You'll be back by nightfall before dark," he said. "I won't leave you longer than that." There was something in his tone, certainty mixed with a softer note he never quite let surface. She felt it settle inside her, warm despite the cold. After he left, the silence deepened. Nora built a careful fire, just enough to warm her hands. Heat crawled through her fingers, bringing back feeling. Once her breath steadied, she wandered through the ruins. Fort Kincaid had been abandoned to time, but time had not fully claimed it. Old bunks still lined one barracks. A rusted lantern lay in the dirt, in what once had been the command office. A toppled file box lay wedged beneath a collapsed beam, half buried in dust. Curiosity tugged at her. She knelt, brushing away cobwebs and lifting the lid. Inside, papers had fused together from moisture and age, but some remained legible. Orders, supply logs, cavalry rosters. Then her fingers froze. A name leapt out from the page, faded ink, but unmistakable. Captain Charles Merriweather. Her breath snagged in her throat. The same Merriweather who signed off on the false ledger. The same man who supervised the office where she worked. The man whose books she found the ones that cost her everything. Nora stared at the page, the truth rising cold and inexorable as the winter wind. This man had been here, had served at this fort, had left a trail long before she ever crossed his path. When Elias returned, the sun was low and the cold sharper. He stepped into the officers' quarters, stamping snow from his boots, and stopped short when he saw her pale face. "What happened?" he asked. She held out the papers, with shaking hands. Look. Elias took them, scanning slowly. The room shifted around him, shadows lengthening as the fire crackled in the grate. Captain Merriweather, he read aloud. His voice thinned, his shoulders straightened. Something old and dark crossed his expression. You know him, Nora whispered. Elias didn't answer at first. Instead, he sank onto the overturned cot frame, the papers trembling just slightly in his hands. He was the one, Elias said finally. The man who gave the order at Dead Horse Pass. We were escorting a Mexican supply wagon food and blankets for families south of the border. Someone claimed smugglers were using it as a front. Merriweather told us to fire anyway. Nora swallowed. And did you? I tried to stop it. Tried to pull a kid out of the wagon before the bullets hit. His jaw tightened so hard she thought it might break. Didn't make it. That's when I walked away from the cavalry. Joined the Crowder boys for a while. Just to get as far from the uniform as I could stand. Nora stared at him, the pieces rearranging in her mind. Merriweather left the army. Elias continued. Got himself a fine position with Western Continental. They said he was a financial genius. Paper never mentioned the blood. Nora pressed a hand to her mouth. Then all this, what happened to me, it wasn't about the ledgers. It was because I saw something that pointed back to him. Elias nodded slowly. Same man, same signature, same trail of ruin. It felt unreal that two lives, two separate tragedies, one in Kansas City and one on a dusty ridge years ago, both stemmed from the same name, inked across fading paper. Corruption didn't wear one uniform. It changed coats as needed blue cavalry, gray railroad, same poison underneath. Nora's voice shook. What do we do now? Elias folded the papers carefully, as though handling a wound. When he looked up, something hard had settled behind his eyes, a quiet decision forged from old regret and new resolve. I've been running from this ghost for years, he said. Didn't think I'd ever face him again. Nora stepped closer. You don't have to. Yes, he said, rising to his feet. I do. She saw it then, the man who rode with wolves, the man who walked away from a boy dying in the dust, the man who caught her in the dark. Elias wasn't choosing this fight because he wanted to. He was choosing it because it had always been waiting for him. The wind whistled through the broken window, tugging at the edges of the old papers in his hand. And Nora realized whatever happened next. None of them would walk away unchanged. Snow still clung to the rooftops when Elias rode into Red Hollow alone. The wind bit through his coat, carrying the scent of cold iron and coming trouble. Over the past hour, smoke had risen thinly from chimneys, people stepping out to split wood or light their stoves. Nothing felt different at first glance, but the air was wrong. Too quiet, too stiff, as if the whole town held itself in place, waiting for something to break. Marshal Lawson stood in front of the copper spur, jaw tense, coat dusted with fresh snow. Edgar Pike was beside him, puffed up like a rooster ready to crow, a fresh wanted poster in hand. When Elias pulled Rayner, his gelding, to a stop, Pike's smile curled like a knife. Well now, Pike said, look who wandered back. Lawson stepped forward. Where's Nora? Elias swung down from the saddle, with a slow, deliberate ease. He didn't look toward Alma's boarding house, though he felt her eyes burning from behind the curtains. I can take you to her, he said calmly. Gasps rippled through the bystanders. Alma burst out onto her porch, apron still tied around her waist. Elias Rourke. You hold your tongue. Elias didn't turn. Price is $500, he said. Same as your poster. Pike's grin widened. So you were hiding her. Does it matter? Elias asked. You want her? I know where she is. Reverend Cole appeared from behind the chapel, face pale. Elias, son, what are you doing? But Elias's expression didn't flicker. If anything, it hardened into something colder than the frost beneath their boots. He met Pike's eyes with a flat, tired stare. You want her? You follow me. Alma spat the words like they burned her tongue. You're selling her out like some outlaw, after all she's been through. The town murmured sharp whispers, slicing through the cold. Knew he'd turn, once an outlaw, always an outlaw. Crowder gang trash. Lawson's mouth tightened. Elias, I vouched for you once. Don't start now, Elias said. You'll only regret it. Pike nodded to two hired guns railroad men with stiff coats and polished rifles. We ride now. Elias mounted again. South Gulch, he said. She's headed that way. Trying to reach the rail line before nightfall. Pike smirked. Smart girl. Shame she trusted the wrong man. Elias didn't answer. He simply turned his horse and kicked into a canter, snow spraying behind him. The three railroad men followed, and Red Hollow watched him go, some with anger, some with pity, none knowing the whole truth. Not yet. The gulch was a long scar running through the land, narrow, twisted, flanked by walls of red stone. Snow clung only where the wind couldn't reach, gathering in quiet pockets like forgotten memories. Elias led Pike deeper, hooves clattering on frozen earth. You sure she's down here? One hired gun muttered, scanning the ridges. Positive, Elias said. Pike narrowed his eyes. Funny, you don't look like a man who just betrayed someone. Done it before, Elias replied. Gets easier. Pike chuckled. I knew you were our kind of outlaw. Elias didn't look back. I'm not your kind of anything. They rode another half-mile before reaching the jagged opening of an old mine shaft carved into the base of the ridge. Broken timber braces jutted out like ribs of a long-dead beast. Elias stopped. She ran in there, saw her tracks. Pike dismounted, lantern in hand. Boys, with me. Elias slid off his horse, brushing snow from his coat. Mind the right wall, he said, weak in spots. The three men strode into the dark mouth of the mine, lantern light bobbing like a will-o'-the-wisp. Elias waited until their shadows disappeared. Then he moved. He mounted again, rode 30 yards up the slope, and reached the place he'd prepared earlier. Small stones piled against a precarious overhang. A simple trap, not to kill, just to buy time. He dismounted and kicked the wedge. The earth shuddered. A muted crack snapped through the frozen air. Then a cascade of rocks tumbled down, sealing the mine entrance with a roar that echoed through the gulch like thunder. Inside, Pike's furious curses ricocheted off the containment of stone. Rourke, you son of a... Get back here. Elias didn't stay long enough to listen. He swung into the saddle and spurred the gelding hard, galloping down the gulch, with wind stinging his face. His heart pounded, not with triumph, but with the grim knowledge he'd only bought them hours, maybe less. Pike would claw his way out, angrier, hungrier, more dangerous than before. The sky had darkened by the time Elias reached the ridge again. Snow fell more heavily, blurring the world into shifting shapes and shadows. He kept riding, breath sharp in the cold, knowing Nora was waiting alone in the old fort, counting on him to return, and knowing this act, this lie, this bluff had cost him dearly. Red Hollow would not forget. Pike would not forgive. And night was falling fast. The storm thickened around him, swallowing his form. All he could do was ride harder, hoping the darkness would hide him from the consequences, galloping close behind. The storm arrived earlier than Elias expected. Wind clawed across the ridge, flinging snow sideways in long, white sheets. Hoofprints vanished almost as soon as he made them, swallowed by the cold night. He pushed the gelding harder, praying he wasn't already too late. Behind him, far behind, but gaining the sound of horses cutting through the storm, rose like the growl of some furious animal. Edgar Pike had escaped. Elias could feel it in the way the night clenched around him. Evil had a way of returning to its mark. By the time Elias reached Fort Kincaid, the place looked less like a ruin and more like a wounded giant, bracing for another blow. The crumbled walls cast jagged shadows across the snow. The old flagpole shivered in the wind, its halyard humming like a broken violin string. Inside the officers' quarters, Nora set down the tin of beans she'd been warming. A distant crack split the cold. Not thunder, not winter breaking a tree. A gunshot. Her blood iced. More cracks followed, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind from somewhere down the slope. Elias was in trouble. She grabbed the spare rifle Elias had left her, its weight awkward in her shaking hands, and stepped outside. Snow stung her face. The night glowed a faint blue from the rising moon. And down the ridge, under the black outline of pines, shadows moved. 3, no 2. 2 riders pushing through the storm. Her heart hammered. Pike was coming. She could hide. Elias told her to hide. But every instinct in her rose in violent refusal. She wasn't going to be tossed aside again. Not by fate, not by men who thought her life disposable. Nora climbed the stone steps to the broken rampart, boots slipping on ice. Wind whipped loose hair into her face. From the height, she saw muzzle flashes bloom like wicked flowers in the dark below. Lighting Pike's twisted expression for half seconds at a time, she braced the rifle on the edge of the wall. "Steady, steady," she whispered, though the words did little to calm her trembling. A bullet sparked off the stone near her hand. She flinched, fingers numb with cold and fear. The rifle nearly fell from her grip. She squeezed her eyes shut once, inhaled through the pain, then lifted it again. "Come out. Miss Carter," Pike's voice cut through the night like a serrated blade. "Your friend can't save you forever. Another shot, carved stone, inches from her foot." Nora ducked low, heart pounding so hard it shook her ribs. In the courtyard below, Elias burst in through a gap in the crumbling wall, snow flying from his coat as he sprinted for the rampart. "Nora," he shouted. "Get down." She didn't. Through the veil of snow. Pike climbed the rampart's opposite stairs, boots crunching on shattered stone. His gun glittered under the moon. The wind howled like a wounded thing between them. "You should have stayed hidden," he sneered. "Could have spared yourself the fall." He raised his gun. Nora fired first. Her shot cracked through the night, slamming into the stone inches from Pike's boot. She'd fired too fast, too scared. Pike's mouth twisted. "Wrong aim, sweetheart." He pulled the trigger. The stone beneath Nora's foot exploded. She slipped. Her body pitched backward off the rampart gravity, dragging her down the outer wall of the fort. The world spun walls. Sky. Snow. Blur. Her scream lost to wind. Then a miracle of instinct. Her fingers snagged a jagged ledge. Pain ripped through her arms. Her nails tore. Her feet kicked at empty air, 20 feet above frozen ground. From above, Pike laughed softly. "Just finish the fall. Girl, nobody will miss you." Nora's grip faltered. Her fingers bled. Her strength waned. Then Elias appeared sliding across the rampart on his knees, grabbing her wrists with both hands before she slipped completely. "I've got you!" "Nora!" he shouted over the storm. "I've got you this time. You don't fall alone. Her breath hitched. Fear and relief crashed together in her chest like colliding waves. She clung to him, shaking so hard she could barely breathe. Elias dug his boots into the stone, muscles straining. Hold on. Just hold on. Bit by bit, he hauled her upward. Snow whipped around them, blurring everything except the raw determination in his face. Pike's steps crunched closer behind him. Elias didn't look back. With a final heave, Nora slid onto the rampart floor, collapsing against Elias's chest. He wrapped one arm around her, shielding her with his body as Pike raised his gun again. You think you've won? Pike hissed. I'll end a shot, cracked. Pike jerked, stumbling back, clutching his arm. His gun clattered to the stones. Nora stared at her hands. The rifle was in them, again, barrel smoking. She didn't remember grabbing it, didn't remember aiming, just the flash of terror when Pike's weapon lifted toward Elias's back. Elias steadied her shaking shoulders. It's done. Easy now, you're all right. But Pike wasn't done. He lunged for his fallen gun, and a voice thundered, "Don't move." Marshal Lawson stepped through the shattered doorway, lantern held high, and behind him a small posse men of Red Hollow. Faces grim, guns drawn, Lawson's eyes flicked from Elias, to Nora, to the bleeding detective on the stones. Pike, he said coldly, you're under arrest. You'll get a trial, not a bullet. That's how we do things here. Pike spat blood in the snow. You don't know who you're crossing. Oh, I know, Lawson replied, and I'm done looking the other way. Two men seized Pike, wrestling him to his feet and binding his hands. His curses echoed through the fort, swallowed by the storm. Nora leaned into Elias, trembling uncontrollably. Her voice was barely a whisper. I thought I was going to die again. Elias held her close, snow melting in his hair. Not while I still breathe. But in the darkness behind Lawson's lantern, the storm thickened, and in it, Nora felt the truth tonight had changed everything. And the railroad wasn't finished, not by a long stretch. Snow thinned as the weeks passed. Winter loosened its grip on Red Hollow. Little by little ice, melting into thin rivulets, rooftops shedding their white burden, the chapel yard softening under cautious sunlight. Life returned, slowly, as if unsure it was welcome. The same could be said for peace. A federal investigator arrived from Cheyenne on a wind-bitten Wednesday morning. Stepping off the small supply wagon, with a leather satchel and an expression that looked carved from oak. His name was Samuel Yates, tall, quiet, the kind of man whose shoes left no sound on the wooden boardwalk. He spent 3 days speaking with Marshal Lawson, piecing together every thread, Elias's testimony at Fort Kincaid, Nora's explanation of the ledgers, Pike's furious confessions shouted through the bars of his cell. The investigator pored over the old papers Elias and Nora had found at the fort, cross-checking signatures, dates, supply routes, and one by one, the truth shook loose. Stolen funds from widows' pensions, false ledgers, forged authorizations, a chain of corruption running from military contracts straight into Western Continental payroll threads, leading not to Nora Carter, but to senior management back in Kansas City, names bigger than hers, men higher than her old desk could ever see. The newspapers caught wind, Cheyenne, Laramie, even a Denver sheet picked up the story. In every one, her name was printed not under wanted, but under cleared. Some papers even added a line about the bravery of a frontier town that didn't turn her in. Nora read each article in Miss Alma's kitchen, hands trembling around the newsprint. Alma stood behind her, wiping her eyes with her apron, like she'd been chopping onions no one else could see. The next morning, Marshall Lawson walked down Main Street with a hammer in one hand and a small bundle of posters in the other. One by one, he tore the wanted notices from the porch posts. The saloon rail, the general store window, he ripped the last one from the outside wall of the copper spur and held it up to the sunlight. Nora's face stared back, drawn in thick lines by a man who had never met her. Lawson lowered the paper slowly, jaw working. "Time to bury this," he said. He folded it once, twice, then dropped it into the fire barrel behind the saloon. Smoke curled upward, carrying her old life into the morning sky. Red Hollow gathered that night in the chapel, not out of celebration. This was not a celebrating town, but out of something gentler. Acceptance, gratitude, a kind of quiet pride that their little place on the map had stood firm when the world tried to roll over them. Reverend Cole offered a prayer. Miss Alma baked 2 pies. Even the Crowley boys tried to sit still in their pews, though they failed spectacularly. When Nora stepped outside afterward, the air smelled of wood smoke and thawing earth. She was free in a way she'd never imagined. With her name cleared, she could ride anywhere, Cheyenne, Denver, Salt Lake, all the way to the coast if she wished, which was exactly the problem. The next day, Investigator Yates called at Alma's boarding house. He removed his hat as he stepped into the parlor, respectful but direct. "Miss Carter," he said, "the Department of Pensions has vacancies in Cheyenne. They'd be fortunate to have someone with experience and with your integrity." Nora blinked in surprise. "You're offering me a job. Better than clerking for a railroad," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his face. "Government bookkeeping, honest work, good pay, safe, safe." The word hung in the air like a warm blanket she wasn't sure she deserved. That same evening, as if fate enjoyed symmetry, a letter arrived for Elias, hand-delivered by a passing rider. The owner of a ranching outfit down in Amarillo needed a trail boss for the spring cattle drive. Good wages. Room for a man ready to ride far and fast. "Could outrun your past," the writer said lightly before heading on. Elias turned the letter over in his hands for a long while. 2 nights later, Nora and Elias walked together along the half-frozen creek outside town, boots crunching patches of lingering ice. The sky was painted in a wash of pink and gold, the sun sinking behind distant ridges. Their breath puffed in soft clouds that mingled between them. Nora spoke first. "You're thinking about taking it." Elias didn't deny it. "Texas Trail's good money, clean work, gives a man space and distance," she said quietly. He stopped walking, the creek murmuring faintly at their feet. "You've got your offer too? Cheyenne ain't far by rail. 2 days' ride. You could start fresh without looking over your shoulder." Nora looked toward the distant rail line, a silver thread glinting in the fading light. The memory of iron wheels and a cold shove into the night pressed against her ribs. "Freedom," she murmured, "is a strange thing." Elias's voice came low, almost hesitant. "You're free now, Nora. Free to go anywhere a ticket can take you." She turned to him, really seeing him. The man who caught her from a train she was meant to die under. The man who stood between her and Pike. The man who carried ghosts heavier than hers, but still found room for her in the quiet spaces of his life. She reached out, gently tracing the frayed edge of his coat sleeve. "Freedom isn't just how far you can ride," she said softly. Her voice trembled, but the truth didn't. "It's who you ride beside." Elias looked at her, long, quiet, unreadable, and the creek's frozen surface carried their silence downstream. They stood like that until the sun dipped below the ridge and the cold pressed closer. Neither spoke of a choice. Not yet, because sometimes the hardest decisions aren't made with words, but with the pauses between them. And tonight's pause felt like the edge of something neither quite dared touch. Spring came to the Wyoming Territory like a man waking careful from a long, violent sleep. Snow still clung to the shadows beneath the pines, but the sun was winning now. The air felt damp with thaw, smelling faintly of cold earth and new grass that hadn't yet found the courage to grow. Outside Red Hollow, the little depot sat on its lonely stretch of track, a single bench. A half-painted sign and a pot-belly stove inside the waiting room that rattled whenever the wind changed. The same Western Continental line that had once thrown Nora Carter into the dark now rolled through the valley with the promise of timetables, destinations, and freshly printed tickets. Nora stood on the platform that morning, gloved hands folded neatly around a small rectangle of paper, Cheyenne, printed in crisp black ink. Her breath fogged faintly as she looked down at it. A real ticket, paid with honest money, no fear tucked between its edges. For the first time in months, maybe years, her future wasn't something she ran toward or away from. It simply waited, quiet as the tracks stretching silver into the distance. Miss Alma fussed over her coat, tugging at the sleeves like a mother hen. You got food packed? You got water? You got that tin of salve? For your hands, I have everything. Alma, Nora said, smiling softly. A small army of children from the chapel school huddled around her skirts. Eddie Crowley sniffled loudly, wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve. You ain't gonna teach us any more? Nora knelt, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. I taught you what mattered most. You'll be all right. All of you will. The boy threw his arms around her neck. The others followed, a tangle of little hands and patchwork coats. Each one tugged at her heart in a different way. Reverend Cole stood a few steps back, hat pressed respectfully to his chest. Whichever way you ride, Miss Carter, the Lord goes with you. She nodded, blinking against the sting in her eyes. Elias waited near the freight shed, a few yards away, lean, quiet, still as a fence post sunk deep into the earth. He didn't come closer, didn't call her name, didn't reach for her. His hat brim cast his eyes in shadow, but she knew the expression anyway hope, mixed with a kind of quiet surrender. He wouldn't ask her to stay, not Elias. He'd spent too much of his life being told where to stand and who to be. Steam hissed, drifting like ghostly breath along the ground. The rails hummed, a long, low whistle rolled across the hills, and the train rounded the bend, gliding into view. Its wheels screamed once against the track before settling into a slower rhythm as it pulled alongside the platform. Doors opened. A conductor in a blue coat called Cheyenne, Cheyenne eastbound. Connections west and south, people glanced at Nora, some with warm eyes, some curious, some already assuming she'd step aboard and leave the dusty little town that had nearly broken her heart and stitched it back together in the same breath. Nora stepped forward. Her boots clicked softly on the wooden planks. She approached the metal step of the passenger car, ticket clutched between her fingers. A swirl of steam drifted around her, tugging at the hem of her coat. She placed one foot on the step, then she paused. The conductor looked down at her. Miss Cheyenne Nora didn't answer. She looked at her ticket, looked at the open door, looked at the train that had once nearly ended her life, and now waited obediently for her command. Then, slowly, deliberately, she folded the ticket, crisp edges against her glove, once, twice. tucked it into her pocket, and stepped back. Off the platform, down onto the gravel and cinders. Gasps whispered through the waiting crowd. Miss Alma's hands flew to her mouth. The children stared wide-eyed, as if watching a magic trick they didn't understand. Nora walked across the small yard, her steps quiet, sure. Elias watched her come, his breath hitching, just once, barely enough to notice, but enough for her to feel across the space between them. She stopped in front of him. Wind tugged at her hair. Cinders crunched under her boots. "Last time," she said softly. "A train decided for me." Elias lifted his gaze, slow and uncertain. "Nora, this time, I decide." A long, quiet heartbeat passed between them. Then she said the words with steady calm, as if they'd been lived 1,000 times, before finally being spoken aloud. "Ride with me." Elias. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. A lifetime of roads, hard ones, seemed to run behind his eyes. Then he smiled, not wide, not bright, just slow, real, and warm, like a man seeing spring rise from snow after too many winters. He offered his hand. Always. He helped her up onto his horse, her skirts brushing against the worn leather, her fingers slipping naturally around his. She settled into the saddle as though she'd been riding beside him her whole life. The train gave one last whistle and began to pull away, its wheels clattering into distance. Nora and Elias turned their horse toward the open country. Behind them, Red Hollow stood small but steady, smoke curling from chimneys, the chapel bell rope swaying gently, though no one had touched it. Before them stretched two choices, the rails in one direction, iron and certain, and the wide, open land in the other, uncertain, wild, alive. They chose the open land. Side by side, they rode into the rising light, dust kicking up in soft plumes, the world unfolding ahead like a long, merciful breath. And as they disappeared beyond the ridge, the quiet truth settled over the valley like a blessing. Sometimes the world throws you from the train. Sometimes it's the best thing that ever happens to you, if someone is there to catch you and ride with you the rest of the way. Sometimes healing begins where we least expect it, in the hands of a stranger, on a night we thought would swallow us, or in a town that barely knows our name. Nora and Elias both carried wounds older than their footsteps, the kind that don't bleed on the outside but shape the way a person walks through the world. Neither of them went looking for salvation. Neither believed they deserved a second chance. Yet life has a quiet way of guiding two broken paths toward the same patch of light. What their story reminds us is simple, but not small, that the hardest falls can sometimes lead us exactly where we need to be. And that strength doesn't always roar, it often shows up as a steady hand refusing to let go. And maybe that's the real mercy of the West, or of life itself, that no matter how far we've been thrown, there's always the possibility someone will choose to ride beside us. Not because they have to, but because they see the part of us worth staying for. In the end, healing isn't about distance traveled. It's about who's willing to walk or ride the road with us. Thank you for spending this time with us, and for letting this story settle a little in your heart. Out here in the quiet corners of the West, every tale carries a spark of kindness, courage, or second chances, and it means more than you know to have you listening. Your presence keeps these forgotten echoes alive. Thank you for being here with us. Every like, share, and subscribe helps us tell more stories that touch the soul. Until the next quiet night and the next small flame, we'll be right here, waiting by the fire.